Tony, great to be back with you.
As always, Dan, lovely to be with you and our listeners.
All right, great. So let's start with the demonstrations that took place over the weekend across the country, across all capital cities and major regional centres. There was a lot of people turning out, mostly in relation to protesting the government's mass migration policy, but also many other issues have bubbled to the surface. So Tony, just keen to get your perspective and assessment of those demonstrations and what they might be saying about the current political climate in our country.
Well, thanks, Dan. And it's pretty obvious that a lot of ordinary Australians, everyday people, not extremists, not neo-Nazis, are feeling fed up with government that doesn't appear to be taking them seriously. And whether it's mass migration or net zero, people think that there are obvious things that need to change: the energy insanity, the out-of-control migration program. But government is either ignoring them or it's ineffective in responding to them. So that's what we really saw on the weekend. I think a cry of dismay and even anger from 99.9% decent people who think that their country is changing for the worse and they're not being asked about it. It's happening without their say-so, often by stealth, and they're understandably unhappy. So I think what's really needed is for government, instead of denouncing people as right-wing nut jobs and bigots and even neo-Nazis, instead of denouncing people, the important thing is to look seriously at their concerns. Where people are right, respond positively. Where people are misguided, have an honest conversation with them and explain exactly why it is that the government is doing what it wants as opposed to what quite a lot of people might want. So I think really what we've witnessed on both of these issues is a failure, particularly by this government, but to some extent by all our major parties, a failure to take seriously people who think that our country is changing before their eyes for the worse.
I thought it was interesting because very rarely do mainstream Australians take to the streets, and we've seen this happen in a major way twice in the last few years. The first was over COVID, certainly in Melbourne, where there were hundreds of thousands of people that took to the streets in Melbourne, and secondly, these demonstrations and protests. So it is quite unusual. Usually the protests are the reserve of the activist brigade, but the fact that normal people are taking to the streets suggests that something is very wrong.
You're absolutely right, Dan. And the interesting thing about these protests, and the papers report that there were some 50,000, the papers and police report that there was some 50,000 on the streets around the country. The interesting thing about them is there was no prominent figure who summoned them to action. They were really just spontaneous eruptions, grassroots expressions of unhappiness. The only significant person who addressed these rallies was Pauline Hanson in Canberra. So they were very much expressions of grassroots dismay. And the fact that even without significant leadership, you had 50,000 people on the streets makes me think that this unhappiness really is quite widespread. And certainly if you look at the opinion polls, well over 50% of people will tell pollsters that current rates of immigration are either too high or far too high. And this is why I think government shouldn't just talk about what it might do to bring immigration down, but actually has to change policy and change policy fast.
And one of the things at the demonstrations we saw were a lot of displays of the Australian flag. Unusual these days to see only the Australian flag flown, but we saw a lot of the flag, and of course we've got National Flag Day on Wednesday this week, so a timely demonstration of our national flag.
Well, you're right, Dan, and it is a little unusual these days to see a demonstration that flies the Australian flag and only the Australian flag, although I do note that there was the blue ensign and the red ensign, both of which are official flags, one of which is our national flag, as opposed to the Aboriginal flag and the Palestinian flag, which seem to be flying far more frequently on our streets these days. So look, good to see decent Australians who are proud of our country, who want it to evolve, not to change radically and drastically, and who are proud to walk under, stand behind our one Australian flag, the beautiful flag of stars and crosses, which is the flag of all of us.
And of course, the flag itself was a product of the community. I mean, this is something the elites have never understood, which was there was a contest in the late 1800s to actually have, well, what is our national flag going to be? And there was something like 1% of the entire population submitted a design to the committee for what the flag is going to be. And many of those submissions included something with the Union Jack, something with the Southern Cross in it. So those such as Paul Keating, who keep going on about how we have to change our flag, they are in the tiny minority of elites who have not been a part of the construction of the flag and design of it, and who don't understand that this was a product of the community, which is why we love our flag.
Completely correct. And there was actually quite a history to our flag. In fact, the forerunner to our flag was the Anti-Transportation League flag in the 1850s. So almost from the beginning, Australians, those who were to become Australians, have been rallying under something very much like our current flag, something which combines both the crosses of St Patrick, St George and St Andrew, and the stars of the Southern Cross.
You mentioned immigration as one of the flashpoints, and clearly the size of the immigration program has gotten out of control. Just for context, in the first term of this Labor government, 1.3 million net overseas arrivals, which is by far the largest on record. And every single year of the 3 years of the Labor government's first term, they were record intakes. Nothing is near other than 2007 and 2008 under Kevin Rudd. But since then, there's been nothing near that. So the size has gotten out of control, and clearly we've also got a composition issue with many of the most recent arrivals not sharing, mainstream Australian values. So interested in your perspective on the current migration issue.
It's interesting that while Australia has very successfully, starting with the Abbott government, got illegal migration under control, indeed we haven't had any illegal migration of substance since 2014, we haven't got legal migration under control. In fact, in recent times, legal migration has skyrocketed, mostly because it's being driven by educational institutions which are effectively selling residency as opposed to schooling or studying, and businesses that would prefer not to train up locals or pay locals what locals will work for, and therefore import workers to do entry-level jobs. This idea that Australia has a skills-based immigration program is misleading, to put it at its best. Effectively, we're importing people to do entry-level jobs that Australians won't do. That's not the immigrants' fault. It's our fault for not running a better system. And as well as that, again, I think 99.9% of our migrants come here wanting to join us, not to change us, but all too often they come here and instead of being told that they're now part of the best country on earth, they're told that they're part of a country which should be ashamed of itself because of its past racism and present discrimination, a country that had almost illegitimate origins because of the dispossession of the Aboriginal people and so on. So we really need to get our act together in terms of having a genuine skills-based migration program that's much smaller than the current one, and insisting to new migrants that they're not just living in Hotel Australia, they're actually now part of Team Australia and need to subscribe to the sort of values that until recently we took great pride in.
think it's about it was 500,000 per year, roughly, under the last term of government. Now, they've said they're going to bring it down, but I'll believe it when I see it. Previously, it's been 200 to 300,000. I think it needs to be below 100, probably something like 90 to 100,000, maybe even a temporary pause for the most part till infrastructure catches up. So do you have a particular number in mind of what you think it might be?
Dan, back in about 2017, I think it was, when I was still in the Parliament, I gave what I thought was quite a big speech on this very topic. And back then I said that immigration should be scaled back to the average of the Howard years, which was just over 100,000. Now, at the time, I was taken to task by the then government, particularly by Scott Morrison, who was then the Treasurer, who said that to scale back immigration from about 200,000, which is where it was then, to about 100,000 would cost something like $5 billion a year. And this is because the Treasury boffins think that every migrant is adding to economic growth, and therefore if you reduce migration, you reduce economic growth, you reduce the tax take, and therefore you've got to find savings in order to reduce migration. Now, it's true that most migrants do add to overall economic growth, but they don't necessarily add to growth per capita, growth per person, because a lot of our recent migrants in particular are not as productive as the general Australian population. And this is why, in recent times, even though economic growth has remained, in many cases, in many instances, quite strong, people don't feel more wealthy because growth per person has been declining over the last couple of years, and for quite a few years before then was stagnant. So high immigration is not only putting pressure on our infrastructure, it's not only putting downward pressure on wages and upward pressure on housing costs, it's also masking the fact that in recent times governments have been frightened of economic reform. And so as a substitute for genuine economic reform, they're pumping up the migration figures to give the illusion of growth, which is not translating through to a wealthier and more prosperous society.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it just shows that as Treasurer, Scott Morrison was a sock puppet for the bureaucrats in Treasury, which happens all too often to ministers, which is the bureaucrats that are there for 20, 30, 40 years, they've got their ideas and they go, oh, beauty, here comes a minister that doesn't have any ideas of his own, we'll give him this, and then they go trumpet those lines. But the other point, which you're sort of alluding to, it's not just the per capita, it's the actual lived experience of people on the ground. So all of those things you mentioned, the congestion on the roads, getting into a childcare centre, having access to local amenities, green spaces, affordable housing, getting a GP appointment. I'm not blaming the migrants for this. It's blaming the government's unplanned program. Clearly, people's lived experience is getting much worse and much more difficult. And if you can't see that, then you're fundamentally disconnected from the reality of people's lives.
And perhaps the most dispiriting thing that's happened over the last few days is not the eruption of unhappiness on our streets, which I think was pretty much spontaneous and in 99.9% of cases absolutely genuine. It's been the attempt by the government in particular and the political class more generally to shut this debate down. We really do have to be prepared to discuss the difficult issues, and by repressing discussion, by attacking people who want to raise topics as being divisive, bigoted, even racist, we aren't changing their minds or persuading them that they need to be more high-minded. We're actually just causing these grievances and resentments to fester. So, as I said, what an intelligent polity does in a situation of widespread dissatisfaction is not demonise the dissatisfied, but it explains patiently why people really need to think again. We're not getting that. I mean, if the protesters were wrong, explain exactly why they're wrong. Instead, they've been dismissed and demonised, and that's not going to help. It's certainly not going to help in the long run.
Well, the other topic that's considered controversial by the political class is that of net zero. And we're told, well, we have to do net zero because of climate change. And if you don't support net zero, therefore you're a climate denier and so forth. And it devolves into that ad hominem name calling. But clearly net zero is a policy that is failing our country and continues to do so. The government is doubling down on its policy of probably an 83% cut to emissions in the medium term and sticking to the net zero by 2050. What's your assessment of where the debate currently goes, Tony?
Dan, I don't want to get too hung up over net zero itself, because a commitment to